To the Assistant Minister.
Well, thank you, Deputy Speaker, and I'm elated to be able to speak against this bill. And I do so for a very simple reason. I think I must be one of the few speak against this motion because I must have been one of the few people who's actually read it. Many of my constituents, as I know occurs in many other electorates, have had contact from their community talking about the member for Warringah's bill, whether they'd vote in favour of it, and of course now we've got a motion saying they would like to bring it on. So I actually went and read the bill and tried to understand what it was trying to achieve, what its objective was. And it's quite clear what its plan is. It's to establish a new bureaucracy. And if you actually go and look at the detail of the bill, what it talks about is building a bureaucracy so that they can then go on to develop a plan. It isn't a plan to cut greenhouse gas emissions. It isn't a plan to improve the Australian economy. It isn't a plan to take the Australian community with us. But I'll show you what one is, Deputy Speaker. It's the plan that the Prime Minister tabled in the Parliament yesterday, 130 pages that goes through step by step how we are going to work towards delivering a net zero target by 2050 for the Australian community. It's a plan that's comprehensive. In fact, it's the first economy-wide plan to achieve net zero by 2050 that has ever been presented by a government in this country. And that is a critical change from the past. By comparison, the member for Warringah's bill is a focus on how we build a bureaucracy to be empowered over this parliament to make those decisions for us. And make no mistake, Deputy Speaker, I am a Democrat and proudly a Democrat. The foundation of the Morrison government's approach is to make sure that we take positions to the Australian people, we get them endorsed at an election, and then we go on and implement them. The alternative under the member Warringah's bill that she's presented previously is to create a new climate czar and a series of bureaucrats who would literally have veto powers over this parliament. That is not just an attack on this parliament, though it is. It's an attack on the Australian people and their capacity to be able to have a voice, a discussion and be part of the process in consideration of developing policy to reduce Australia's greenhouse gas emissions. And to her credit, the member for Warringah just outlined that in this parliament in her speech only moments ago, where she talked explicitly about taking climate policy, quote, out of the hands of democratically elected representatives. Now, frankly, I can't imagine that members of even the Labor Party would agree with such a plan to take out of the hands of democratically elected representatives climate change policy. But this is consistent in her approach, where she has sought to undermine not just our democracy, but of course also the Australian people in being part of this conversation. We want to make sure that Australians are part of this conversation, because it's not just a discussion around improving the environment, though it is. It's not just a discussion, of course, about the future of the Australian economy, though it is, but that we want to take rural and regional communities and those that may have impacts on them disproportionately along the journey, because we want to improve their communities and seize the moment and the opportunity. The other thing we heard from the member for Warringah is that, in comparison to the United Kingdom, they have thousands of pages of legislation in different areas of strategies. Well, the simple reality is, yes, we have a 169-page plan without a giant new bureaucracy established by this parliament, as was tabled by the Prime Minister in question time yesterday. But it builds across the pillars that the government has already built in areas such as our modern manufacturing strategy, our critical mineral strategy, where we will seize the moment and the opportunity to extract minerals to be part of the technologies of the future, particularly renewable technologies, to the integration of environmental standards that go into things like the building code. Now, the member for Warringah then goes on and says, well, why not legislate a target? Well, firstly, we took our target to the people at the last election, and it was endorsed by them. The Labor Party took a different target, and of course they were defeated. But more critically, we actually did an international analysis of the number of countries that have legislated targets. Of about 193 countries or thereabouts that have made international commitments, only 7 have legislated their targets. Western Australia and Queensland, their state Labor governments, have not legislated targets. But the member opposite, member for Command, raises the United Kingdom, and I'm quite happy to talk about that, because one of the reasons why we don't go down the path of legislating targets is because it empowers people outside this parliament to override it. We know from the member's legislation that she previously presented to this parliament, Deputy Speaker, that she wanted to appoint bureaucrats who could veto this parliament on climate change policy, as despicable as that is. But you just need to look at how, and the member McMahon raised, what happens in the United Kingdom. They legislated their target. Then what activists are doing is using it as a vehicle to then go on and use the courts to shut down democratic decision-making. We just need to look at it here, Deputy Speaker. Campaigners have launched a legal challenge to try to prevent billions of pounds of taxpayers' money being spent on a huge road-building program which they say breaches the UK's legal commitments. I'm sorry, Deputy Speaker, I'm a Democrat. I believe that parliamentary sovereignty matters. I think the people who are elected to this parliament should decide the law. And it isn't just new road projects. They're trying to shut down the development of new airports. And it doesn't matter what push the Labor Party has and the independent member for Warringah has, I will stand by the Australian people. And we've seen now the human consequences of the European approach, where in the lead-up to this winter we have a backing by bureaucrats on a small number of technologies and the rising risk of higher energy prices and many people increasingly unable to afford the capacity to heat their homes. That is a despicable approach in terms of public policy. We're going to take an approach which backs the Australian people, that backs households, and of course that backs building the future of the Australian economy so that we can take the community with us. And that's why yesterday we hit such a milestone, a coalition government hitting out a target for net zero by 2050 and then a comprehensive plan, a 130-page plan about how we are going to get there. Let's look at it as a comparison to the Australian Labor Party, of course. We know that they don't have a 2030 target. They have a 2050 target, but literally it would fit on a fortune cookie, the extent of the detail. You compare that to the coalition. We take targets to an election. We get them endorsed by the Australian people. We then go on and develop a plan. And, of course, we then go on and implement said plan. Because the planet doesn't care about good intentions alone. It cares about outcomes. And let's look at the record of outcomes. The average emissions reduction since 2005 for OECD countries is 7%. Australia has already reached 21% emissions reduction since 2005, so times 3. You look at comparable countries where you have the United States, it's only achieved about 10%. Then you look at a country like China, that of course has seen emissions rise by nearly 70% over the time frame. What we are showing is leadership. Leadership about how we are going to cut our emissions and provide the pathway for so many other countries to follow that leadership, but in an Australian way that focuses on building the foundations of the Australian economy.
The Minister will resume his seat. The member for Warringah on a point of order.
Point of order, Deputy Chair. This is a motion as to why we should debate this today.
Yeah, no, there's no point of order. The Assistant Minister to continue.
Thank you, and I appreciate the member's irrelevant interjection, because what we're talking about is the substantive issue of how we're delivering a lower carbon future for Australia and building the future of the Australian economy. And one of the critical things about the member for Warringah's bill is that it doesn't rule some things out. And this is important. By staying silent, there's a secret agenda. And what we know from the Labor Party is that they have gone to the elections previously and said, quote, there will be no carbon tax under a government we lead, then go on and implemented it. We know that the member for Warringah wants carbon taxes. Well, this isn't a secret about it, and she won't. If she doesn't, then she can simply rule it out in her bill and say that there shouldn't be carbon taxes, but we know in practice there will be, because what she wants to do is empower bureaucrats to make decisions at the expense of the sovereign people. Our interest is in what we need to do to save the planet. Our interest in what we need to do to cut emissions and continue the trajectory in which we are delivering. But more critically, we want to focus on how we build jobs for the future so that every Australian can realise their ambition, save the planet and make a buck.
The Assistant Minister's time has expired. The question